Numbers and digits have never been my strong suit. And so it should come to you as no surprise that one of the most challenging classes in my seminary training was philosophical logic. You see, in addition to studying theology and Bible exegesis, we in most Catholic seminaries have to take at least 2 years of philosophy. As a part of this philosophical education, we also study logic. And yes, just like math and algebra, logic is full of digits, numbers, and equations. However, there is one sentence I remember from my seminary years of studying logic. Our professor taught us that we often make a mental shortcut about God and that way commit a logical error. And so he explained, everything that God wants happens, but not everything that happens God wants. Did you get it? Let me say it again. Everything that God wants to happen happens, but it does not mean that everything that happens God wants. Too many times we commit this logical error, making an assumption that just because something happened, this was God's will, or this is what God wants. It's not always true. Too many times we make this logical error because of our preconceived notion of how God operates in this world. And so I cannot tell you how many times I have talked to people who were sick or recently diagnosed with a terminal illness and who told me, Father, I accept God's will. If this is what God wants, I accept this cross. You see, by making such a statement, by saying that this cancer or some other difficult illness is happening in my life, it must be what God wants. It's not necessarily true. To be honest, I can't and I won't believe in God who wants pain and death and suffering in our life. Similarly, people say, I lost a great job. I am unemployed now. But when one door closes, another door opens. Perhaps God wanted me to lose that job. Again, just because it happened to you does not necessarily mean that God wanted for it to happen. One of the most extreme examples of such logical error in reference to God's will and our lives can be seen in today's first reading. In this passage from the book of Genesis, God allegedly wants Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac. Abraham believes that God is testing him and demanding that he sacrifices his son. And when it says sacrifice, it doesn't mean cut his hair really short or forbid him to watch TV for a week. No. In that passage, God allegedly wants Abraham to kill Isaac. Abraham believes that this is God's will, this is the test, and he is willing to sacrifice his only child, believing this is what God wants. This story is one of the most challenging pages from the Bible for me personally. And of course, there are very spiritual explanations as to how Abraham successfully emerges from this test of his faith. But you know what? I refuse to believe in God who would even appear to be as cruel as to demand any parent to kill and sacrifice their child. Just because children die sometimes, it doesn't mean that God wants it to happen. The God I believe in, the God of Jesus the Christ, the God of love, does not demand, does not will any child to suffer or die. How do I know that? It's right here in the Bible. I brought with me a big edition of a Bible, a family size. Many of you have this or similar editions of family Bible in your living rooms or in your library, perhaps layered with dust on top of it. But should you one day open your family Bible on Psalm 40 and go all the way to verse 7, you will find a statement that clearly contradicts what Abraham thought God wanted him to do. Psalm 40 verse 7 reads, "Sacrifice and offering you do not want, but ears open to obedience you gave me. Holocausts and sin offerings you do not require. So I said, here I am." Every year, during this holy season of Lent, we as Catholics and Christians have been encouraged to give something up, to sacrifice something in the time of Lent. And so, from the early years of our grade school, until the time we are in our 80s, we try to come up with some original sacrifices for Lent. I know some of you are giving up coffee or alcohol or internet or smoking or God knows what else. But let's be honest. The last 12 months, our long and painful nightmare of this global COVID-19 pandemic has demanded enough sacrifices of all of us. We, you and I, have sacrificed so much in the last 12 months. We have sacrificed loving embraces with our friends and neighbors. We don't hug each other anymore. We have sacrificed going out to restaurants and movie theaters. We have sacrificed playing with our grandchildren. We have sacrificed so much that we are becoming numb to the cruel reality of this pandemic. And even in the midst of all these countless and painful sacrifices, there are some who say there is God's will in all of this. Perhaps God wanted us to suffer through this time of the pandemic to strengthen our faith. You know what I say to such voices? BS. It is not true. The God you believe in, the God who wants you to sacrifice 2.5 million people worldwide to this nasty virus, is not my God. And so, this Lent, we need no more sacrifices. This Lent, we need not to give up something else. Life has taken so much from us. And perhaps instead of sacrificing one more thing, with the psalmist, we should say, "Here I am, Lord. Here I am." Perhaps we need to experience a new understanding of who God is. Perhaps our God needs to transcend our childish and simplistic notions of what God wants. Perhaps we need to experience our own transfiguration of God and our religion. The gospel passage takes us together with James, John, and Peter to Mount Tabor, where Mark says Jesus was transfigured in front of them. And from that moment on, they never looked at their friend the same way. Their understanding was changed of who Jesus is. I believe that our understanding of what and who God is, of what God wants, needs to change if we are to keep our integrity. We cannot believe any longer in God who demands sacrifices. We cannot believe one day longer in God who desires Holocaust. And how much that word has changed in the last 100 years or so. Even though originally it stood for burnt offerings placed on the altar in the temple. Today, after World War II, we know that Holocaust means so much more than that. Did God want that sacrifice of 6 million Jewish lives? Did God desire that Holocaust to happen? Of course not. God didn't want Isaac to be sacrificed. God did not want you to get cancer. God does not want your father or mother to suffer. God doesn't want you to go to the painful process of divorce or unemployment. The pain and suffering and evil in our world is not what God wants. What does God want? God, him or herself, said it clearly in today's gospel. As Jesus was transfigured in front of James, Peter, and John, a voice of God, Mark writes, said, "This is my beloved Son. What I want of you is listen to him." In face of all the pain, suffering, and countless sacrifices we all have been dealt, we need to listen to Christ. We need to hear his invitation to love God, to love ourselves, and to love our neighbors. If your God is more about sacrifices and giving things up than love, we believe in two different gods. Pain and evil and death exist, but just because they exist, it doesn't mean that God wills them. As we continue this holy season of Lent, as we remember that not everything that happens God wants, let us hear one more time the call of the psalmist from Psalm 40, verse 7. Sacrifice and offering you do not want, but ears open to obedience you gave me. Holocausts and sin offerings you do not require. So I said, here I am.